Hey, what's up? It's Canucks This Week with Dan and Randip. And the Canucks announced Patrik Allvin as the new GM of the club yesterday. President Jim Rutherford made that announcement. And he also gave us a little hint as to what direction the team is headed in at the deadline. Have a listen.
We got to figure out a way to get a little cushion on the cap. It's always difficult, but being up against the cap and a team that's not in the playoffs at this point in time is not a good thing. So some big decisions are coming up.
There is President Jim Rutherford. So, Randip, what is that first big decision that the Canucks have to make?
Yeah, I love how Jim Rutherford does not pull any punches. A hint, yeah, he gave a very strong one. The first move, all eyes on JT Miller. This is a top 20 point scorer in the NHL this year. For the most part, he's been there. He's been a point per game player. But here's the issue for the Vancouver Canucks. You might be asking, why would you even consider this player as a part of any move? He's a free agent, not after this year, but the year after. And if at this point, the Canucks need to kind of figure out what they're going to be able to do with the JT Miller. And that's why, long-term deals for players that are going to be 30 by the time you sign that contract, that's always a slippery slope. Is this the time to be making a deal on JT Miller? I believe it is, especially if you don't know if that player wants to stay in Vancouver. His market is really high right now. There are a number of teams, including the New York Rangers, Minnesota Wild, the Boston Bruins, and even the Calgary Flames that are rumored to be linked to this guy. So if you can potentially package him for something at this point in time, Dan, JT Miller is the move I'm looking at. I think all of the NHL world is looking at him as well, because if he pops up on a trade board, he's probably at number one or number two. That's how highly rated this player is. And that's why Jim Rutherford's and Patrik Allvin's first move is probably looking at JT Miller and what you can do with them based on the fact that his value is through the roof right now.
Absolutely. And, given the cap number and the fact that a contending team would get JT Miller for this playoff run and another one next year, that really increases his value on the market. To me, he would be the number one asset at the trade deadline from a forward perspective. Of course, Jakob Chychrun is the prized possession that everybody's looking at and waiting for. But beyond that, JT Miller would be the number one trade deadline target from a forward perspective. He can play center. He can play the wing. He scores at a point per game rate. He is a power play savant. He works on the penalty kill too. I mean, there's nothing JT Miller doesn't really do. And he's been a leader for the Vancouver Canucks as well. The problem is, they don't really, not only the age and having to give him a long-term deal, they also need to find ways to create some cap space, as Jim Rutherford mentioned in that clip. They have other guys to sign, like Bo Horvat. And there's some question as to whether or not JT Miller would like to see what other teams have to offer should he make it all the way to free agency, and if he would like to move back south of the border. These are questions that are fair to ask right now, especially in the NHL climate, as we know. But then the question becomes, Randip, is it purely a futures trade, or is it, looking for a player that is younger, that fits maybe more of the core age of the roster, around the untouchables of Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes and Thatcher Demko, guys that are in their early to mid-20s with maybe more control? How do you think Canucks management targets the return for JT Miller should they go about a trade at the deadline?
If this was a 4 or 5 year build or a rebuild, I think, the futures and the first round picks, and is that's what you're focusing on. But with what Jim Rutherford and Patrik Allvin has said, this is a team that more than anything, the window looks like maybe 2-3 years is what they're looking at. They want to build a contender in that time. And for that perspective, you want somebody who's in their early 20s. You don't want a first round pick that potentially with a good team is maybe be a 20th pick overall. There's going to be some time that's required to let that pick marinate, let that player become an established NHLer if they do become one. So I look at this JT Miller potential deal and say, no, you got to get that player that's kind of along the same lines as a Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson. Maybe in those early 20s, you have control and can be an impact player for you, maybe in a year or two. That is something that I think the Canucks are focusing on in the short term here. Yes, they want to try to pick up a number of different types of players Jim Rutherford's mentioned that, hey, European free agents, college free agents. What does that imply? They want players right now, or if not now, very, very soon. So any deal for JT Miller, I think the foundational piece in that deal would have to be a player that is currently playing in the NHL or that is very close and on the cusp of playing in the NHL. That's why first round picks, I'm sure, they might be a part of the equation. But if you're talking about a foundational piece, you're looking at, if you're the New York Rangers, you're looking at Niels Lundqvist. You're looking at other players across the NHL on teams that are kind of ready to take that step up in their early 20s. And that's why picks, it's nice to add them in there, but the foundational piece, I want a young player.
Yeah, I do think they do get a first round pick for JT Miller, but the type of prospect they're looking for, I think, is what you mentioned there. Maybe it's a Matt Boldy out of Minnesota, even if it's a forward. A right shot D would be something brilliant to bring into this organization right now that I'm sure they would absolutely love. The one thing about JT Miller, too, if they do go about moving him, I think it makes Bo Horvat a lock to sign an extension, because this team, if they are looking at this window of, keeping it together or resetting it to really push forward in 2 to 3 years' time, well, where are you going with Elias Pettersson as your one center and then basically nothing behind it? You have to keep Bo Horvat, who is also a free agent at the end of next season. Now, when we think about the cap cushion, Randip, how do they go about doing that? I mean, almost half the league is already spending into LTIR. It's not exactly an easy thing to do to alleviate cap space in this current climate. What can they do? What can they even explore to get some relief on the cap?
Well, the first question you have to ask with the Vancouver Canucks when you're talking about trading out players is who has value right now? And of those players, who is expendable to you, right? Because if you are trading away one of those least desirable players, guess what? You're probably gonna have to add something for a team to take on salary. So who has value? I look at the middle of this roster and I say, if you're trying to shed salary and there's some value out there, you're probably looking at we've talked a lot about Tyler Mott. Where does he fit on a contender? That gives you a little bit of cap relief. That's the obvious one. He's an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year. It probably makes sense for him to be shipped off, but there has been, reports that maybe he is even somebody that could be in line for an extension. The other name that pops up for me is Jason Dickinson. And this is a strange one because he was just acquired this past offseason. But what have we seen from Jason Dickinson in Vancouver? It hasn't really worked for him. Down the middle, his defensive play has been on and off. Face-off circle, that's not what he does best. We've seen his face-off percentage be pretty poor, actually. On the wings, he's not exactly the fastest of players. He's played well when he's been on the wing, but he doesn't profile as a Jim Rutherford type of winger to me. Remember the teams in Pittsburgh? They had speed down the wings. Jason Dickinson is not exactly a burner. So as far as fits are concerned on this team and a player that has value, I think Jason Dickinson could be an individual that you look at and say, a contender could say, hey, this guy in a checking role makes sense for us. He could play on the wing. Maybe he fits another team's profile a little bit better. I think for the Vancouver Canucks and the way that Jim Rutherford and by extension, Patrik Allvin, maybe want to build this team out. I think that's a player you can say, all right, is there some value here? Maybe you trade him for a draft pick, and then that's how you create that cushion. That's the one player I'm looking at because, Dan, I don't think there's been a fit in Vancouver here. I think they might be looking at searching and seeing if they can find a fit elsewhere.
I mean, look, I get it, and I'm not saying, Jason Dickinson isn't a potential piece that they move. I think you got to be bolder than that, Randip. You do. You absolutely do. You have
before
to
the trade deadline.
Maybe not before the deadline, but looking into the summer, some big decisions that are coming up, as Jim Rutherford mentioned, they have to make a decision on Brock Boeser. He's a restricted free agent, $7.5 million qualifying offer for a player who has had some nice peaks, but has also had some, mediocre results through the first number of years of his career. And the hardest thing with Brock Boeser, from an evaluation standpoint, when he got paid, we thought he was a goal scorer, and a legitimate one that was going to be a guaranteed 30 goal scorer pretty much year in and year out. And he's kind of been that, but not maybe with the consistency that you expected, and certainly not the sniper that we thought he was. His two-way game has developed a little bit more. His playmaking ability has developed a little bit more. but his goal scoring has gone way down. And why do you pay guys in this league? You pay them for goals. And the reason he had such a big qualifying offer is because they thought this guy was going to be an absolute sniper. And given that he's not been that, not shown that consistency on that front, I think he absolutely is something you have to make a decision on going into the summer. And that's more of maybe a hockey trade where you're looking to move that piece for something else that you feel you need on your roster, whether that be a defenseman, something of that nature. Brock Boeser's future, as we know, it's always kind of been in doubt in Vancouver, but I don't think those are going to change unless he signs a long-term extension this summer.
Yeah, I guess the question here is, if we're talking about JT Miller potentially as a most pressing need and the one you have to answer to right now to see what the future is, and then Brock Boeser in the offseason potentially as well, it's a lot of roster surgery going on there, Reach. So, this is what Jim Rutherford does, but the Brock Boeser one is an interesting one because that dollar value, you want to make sure that it matches the player. And as of right now, as much as, there's been progress in Brock Boeser's game from a 200-foot game perspective, there are questions of, okay, is this guy going to be worth a long-term contract at $7-8 million? And that's a real legit question that I think the Vancouver Canucks need to address. So Brock Boeser, I'm keeping that till the offseason. I don't think anything happens in season, as you mentioned. I think offseason, there's a couple of them. One more I'm going to add to the offseason concerns, though, for the Vancouver Canucks, and something that's more of a long-term look. The right side of defense of the Vancouver Canucks is a huge black hole right now. And Tyler Myers, he's actually had a very good year this year. $6 million is still $6 million, but he's played well. Everybody else, Travis Hamonic, barely played. Tucker Pullman, Luke Schen's done a pretty decent job for what he can do in his role, but we would know what Luke Schenn is.
He might have some value at the deadline, Luke.
He might.
He signed for another year at a very reasonable number and is shown to be a pretty steady guy and already has 2 cup rings with Tampa Bay.
But you need to reconstruct that right side. And, where do you move that salary off right now? Travis Hamonic, the way that his situation is played out, he's not going anywhere right now based on the fact that he's got no value. Tucker Pullman, I don't really think he's kind of got any either based on the way that he's played. You'd probably have to retain salary on that long-term deal.
Plus another 3 years left on his deal, right?
Exactly. And then the only player that you might be able to is Tyler Myers, who's making $6 million. But the way that this right side, that's making it $11.5 million combined as of right now, how do you, and that's the second, the entire Canucks defensive unit is the second most expensive in the league. Think about that for a second. It's not good enough on the right-hand side. So when we talk about short-term moves and long-term moves, the right side of defense is just, it's there. There's a huge gap. There's a huge weakness for the Canucks, whether it's in a JT Miller deal, whether it's in a Brock Boeser deal, or creating cap cushion. That right side needs to be addressed.
He is Trader Jim. So Jim Rutherford and his new GM, Patrik Allvin, have a lot of work to do with this Canucks roster. What do you think is that first big decision to come, and how should they make a cap cushion in the offseason? Let us know in the comments. We respond to as many as we can, and we'll see you in the next video.